I'd like to welcome everybody to the marvel of technology. All of us are thankfully vaccinated and in good shape. This is an interesting first attempt by the Friends of Archaeology Bag Lunch to do multiple platform distribution of the Bag Lunch series. And today's presentation is by Dean Willson, our research associate and ceramist par excellence, who has been working with the Museum of Indian Arts and Culture to help them move and catalog all of the vessels from the Maya collections. And this presentation grows out of that. And without further ado, I'm going to turn the digital format over to our analog marvel, Dean Willson.
Hi, I'm Dean Willson, live from the Center for New Mexico Archaeology Library. And as part of this online event, I would like to share images, ideas, and perspectives relating to the connections between the connections of pottery from the Upper San Juan, Rosa, and Gallina traditions. And the basic idea is that that the unique pottery from this distinct and still poorly understood area is seems to be a reflection of a unique adaptation to groups practicing and developing a high agricultural strategy along the slopes, ridges, and upper drainages of the southern Rocky Mountains. Sorry about that. There was a bit of a glitch. And the ideas and images that I'm going to show here, as Eric noted, are the result of an ongoing project that began just a year ago, involving the movement of pottery from their former home on the Museum Hill to their new home in the Center of New Mexico Archaeology, involving over 4,000 vessels from collections and projects across the state, as well as a few other areas. And so, interestingly, we started with the Upper San Juan and the Gallina region, which, as noted, are fairly poorly understood areas. And we were about to continue with looking at the rest of the state. And then we had this pandemic, and we had to stop and put the project on the hiatus. Fortunately, I have a consulting business on the side looking at pottery from the lab in my house, which also, fortunately, one of the main projects that I was doing was also on the Upper San Juan region. And so for a year being in the lab in my house, I kept on thinking about those vessels that I saw from the Upper San Juan region and the Gallina region. And finally, after a year, again, it's safe again to start doing pottery analysis and consultant with the collection managers. And the projects basically involve me looking along with the collection managers doing a type assessment, sometimes looking at the temper with a digital microscope, the form, the shapes, and the manipulations in the wear, and gradually developing a database. And um, after thinking about all this stuff, I decided this would be a really good talk to go back and do an online presentation. So, so the area that we're talking about here is going to be the Upper San Juan, sometimes included into this northern San Juan region. But the idea here is that this is a very distinct tradition and area, and appears as will be indicated by the data presented here, connected with the Gallina, but and sometimes in very complicated ways. And this is going to be a part of doing various traditions. Now with the pandemic over, we're starting to look at pottery such as Mesa Verde, black and white, in the northern San Juan. We'll move to this Chaco stuff in the Civil area, the biscuit wares in Santa Fe, black and white, and northern Rio Grande, the glazed wares, members, black on white in the northern Magallanes, and Casas Grandes in the southern part of the state in Mexico, among a lot of other traditions and pottery types that we hope to look at in the features. Information from the ceramic analysis, along with other archaeological data from various regions, provides critical insights about the nature and connections and differentiation between different areas of the Anasazi Pueblo world. Folks like myself, who commonly analyze pottery in the yellow part of the northern ancestral Pueblo world, often see very similar kinds of variations in pottery with similar sequences that include gradual changes in surface manipulations, paint type, and styles, as well as shifts toward increasingly intricate and organized painted styles for whitewares, and changes from to banded to corrugated textures and graywares. Sometimes we divide northern New Mexico traditions into two different areas described as the Four Corners Anasazi and the northern Rio Grande region, where differences in geology and geography contributed to certain distinctions, but also reflects similar trends through time. One of the most difficult and interesting problem childs sometimes encountered when trying to document and understand pottery change in the northern Pueblo world through classification systems are those darn folks in the northern Gallina highlands, who in many ways seem to have been doing their own thing, which has resulted with them sometimes having been relegated by archaeologists in the past to having been out of step, backwards, or even worse, the infamous Stasi hillbillies. A defense is made here for the noble Gallina and their ancestors, and in fact, they have been misunderstood, and that such distinctions reflect a distinct series of development and innovations by agricultural groups living and farming on the edge of other regional systems. Such developments can be attributed to distinct and in many ways sophisticated mountain Anasazi groups moving across different highland landscapes while adapting to the extreme challenge of high elevation farming on the slopes and upper drainages of the southern Rocky Mountains, en route from one highland mountain range to the next, that ultimately seems to have involved movements from areas within or surrounding the San Juan, Gallina, and Jemez mountains. Much of what is known about the somewhat complicated sequence of change in the upper San Juan region, which was originally assumed by some just to have been the less interesting and backward part of the Mesa Verde tradition, is based on pottery examined during investigations of the Navajo Reservoir Project during the late 1950s and provides clues to the Upper San Juan relationship and the rest of the Pueblo world. The earliest pottery in this area and among the earliest pottery anywhere in the northern ancestral Pueblo world is a site that was originally called Los Pinos, and then transitioned to San Brito, and now we just refer to as San Brito Utility. And this seems, this pottery is very distinct from that occurring at any later occupations, in that it is often oxidized and brown in color with small self-tempered inclusions, very rough forms and bumpy surfaces, and small jars and bowls, and it is most similar to the pottery that we see in earliest sites to the south in the Mogollon and the Holcomb region. And this phase seems to occur from AD 400 to 700. And then this is followed by the basket maker 3 version of the Upper San Juan that includes a mixture of that earlier San Brito utility that developed locally, and then tape in black and white that represents an influence from the northern San Juan regions to the west, that decorated with the crushed igneous rock indicative of that area and mineral paint. And through this time from 300 to 700 AD, the occupation of the Upper San Juan is extremely sparse. And then there is a dramatic increase in the number of sites with a very distinct pottery associated with the Rosa phase, dating from about AD 700 to 850 at sites spread across this Upper San Juan region. The large populations represented by the numerous and widespread Rosa phase sites reflect the dramatic appearance and increase in large and distinct populations along the drainages of the Upper San Juan that reflect numerous sites linked into larger settlement systems that reflect among the earliest aggregated communities in the northern reaches of the ancestral Pueblo world. The majority of this pottery reflects the new tradition, grayware and whiteware tradition introduced during the late San Brito or basket maker 3 period, and represents graywares that are almost identical to those produced in other areas to the west, with the exception that they seem to exhibit a local leucocratic or light-colored igneous rock. This type of pottery probably represents 95% of the pottery that you're going to find on a Rosa phase site. Rosa neck banded and other texture types also begin to occur in sites in the upper San Juan during the Rosa phase. But during the Rosa phase and later phases as well, always tend to be later and in much lower frequencies as compared to other regions of the northern Pueblo. So that we basically have assemblages that are overwhelmingly dominated by plain brown wares. The most distinct development during the Rosa phase as compared to the rest of the northern Southwest is Rosa black and white that is decorated in very distinct designs and on organic paint, very distinct from both the designs and the type of mineral paint used in most of the surrounding regions. The designs exhibit simple and bold styles that appear to be intermediate between basket maker 3 types, such as Chapin black and white, and Pueblo 1 types such as Piedra black and white, defined for the northern San Juan region. Painted designs are often divided in 2 or 3 isolated units composed of a combination of simple elements that include triangles, circles, dots, thick, curved, crossed, and bent lines. Many of these designs are ticked or flagged. Some Rosa black and white vessels display a more complex orientation, with the designs organized in a single band on an all-over pattern that is more common in later forms, in addition to elements found near rims, circles, which may or may not contain additional embellishment that are often present in the center of the balls. While the great majority of vessels represent both forms, the great majority of the painted vessels represent both forms, with a few representing jars. Painted surfaces are almost always unslipped and usually lightly polished. And there are several things that are very distinct about Rosa black and white as compared to pottery produced in the surrounding regions. One, of course, as we said, is so that the distinct designs, they're decorated in an organic paint and a leucocratic igneous, which makes following Rosa black and white, the next type in this sequence is Blancos black and white, which displays variable polishing, is usually not slipped. And temper consists of similar lightly colored igneous, also associated with Rosa. A range of design styles are represented due to the long temporal span of this type. Early designs may represent thinner line, more polished versions of Rosa black and white. Middle period designs include thin lines, triangles, and later elements like that noted on Piedra black and white. And final designs include checkerboard, scrolls, steps, triangles, straight hatcher, all associated with Arbolis and Mancos black and white, and some examples of Gallina black and white. It is, however, often difficult, if not impossible, to distinguish various variants from a general Mancos black and white categories is sometimes useful. And this type seems to be more common in the southern part of the Upper San Juan region. As previously mentioned, the most distinctive characteristic of Rosa black and white as compared to stuff in all the surrounding regions, with the exception of the Cayente or Tucson region in Arizona, is the use of a organic paint. We and this paint seems to be purely an organic material applied with a plant abstract such as beeweed. And in order to see in fact this pottery was distinct, Bob Florich looked at some of the examples here of both Rosa and Bunko's black and white using XR analysis, where a beam was X-rayed, was shined on the pot surface, both unpainted and painted areas of the pot, and then the various heavy minerals, rough frequencies of the heavy minerals were measured. And in fact, this analysis indicates that Rosa black and white was painted with a pure organic abstract, so that that we can't see any remains of any heavy metals, and the overall composition is similar for both the black painted and the white painted areas, and that's because the carbon is too light to be measured in this using this technique. In addition, something else very unusual and interesting about pottery in the upper San Juan during the Rosa phase area is the presence of a glazed paint, particularly in the Durango area. And the examples shown here are part of a project that I did last year while under quarantine for the US 550-160 connection project for Alpine archaeological consultants, pottery from the Durango area. So this reflects the fact that the organic paint recorded for many Rosa black and white shirts, particularly for the westernmost part of this region, appear to be remnants of associated with the glazed paint along with the organic binder. And if you look at these shirts, you can see little areas with very high sheen, where the glaze is still adhered to the pottery. And in fact, the analysis of this pottery does indicate the use of lead pigment, so that all the black or painted areas show very high concentration of glazed paint as compared to the unpainted areas. So the Rosa phase includes this very distinct combination of pottery made from about 700 to 850 AD, where they're using a light colored leucocratic igneous rock temper, organic or glazed paint in styles that are really distinct from that produced in surrounding areas. of the northern Pueblo world. Subsequent occupations in the upper San Juan region reflect a continuation of occupations dating to the late Pueblo I through the late Pueblo periods, often indicating a shift in pottery resources and styles, indicating evidence of much closer connections with areas in the northern San Juan region to the west. Temper consists of an angular gray to white rock fragments, and gray ware is assigned to both Piedra period, representing the late P1, and Arbolist period, equivalent to the Pueblo II, are distinguished based on the type of coil and polish. Less corrugated pottery is found at these sites, and often the corrugated pottery reflects distinct shapes and diagonal patterns as reflected by Payan corrugated. And pH of black and white is an important type, and both sequences defined for both the northern San Juan and upper San Juan region. And there seems to be very, in contrast to the Rosa black and white made during the Rosa phase, there seems to be very few differences in the paint temper or design style associated with pH of black and white as compared to the pottery produced in the northern San Juan or Mesa Verde region to the west. pH of black and white is decorated with iron oxides, and the designs in pH of black and white reflect developments that happened across the Pueblo world during the Pueblo I period. pH of black and white designs are arranged with reference to the rim or circumference of the vessel rather than the center. In contrast to Rosa black and white, many of the pH of black and white designs are arranged as a single unit composed of a series of thin parallel intersecting lines covering a large portion of the vessel surface. These lines are frequently embellished with triangles, flag triangles, and ticked lines. pH of black and white designs are arranged with reference to the rim or circumference of the vessel rather than the center. And they are also distinguished by the use of an iron-based mineral paint and igneous rock that sometimes described as mesocratic, that includes dark and light fragments. And this probably represents a difference in temper collecting strategy, so that the light colored rock that we see during the Rosa phase probably reflects the collection of weathered formations along the alluvial sand along the stream bed. Whereas this rock reflects the crushing of igneous cobbles collected either from river rocks or soft glacial deposits. So this is a very important shift in the overall technology that includes designs, paint, and temper collecting strategies. that are almost identical to that happening in the Mesa Verde or northern San Juan region to the west, in contrast to the unique rose combination of paint styles and temper we see in Rosa. Another type, the occupation within much of the upper San Juan becomes much smaller as during the P2, people start moving downstream into lower elevations and into the Mesa Verde in the San Juan region. Although one local pottery that continued to be produced has been defined as Arborist Black and White, which contains a range of designs that are identical to those described for Cortez and Mencos Black and White for the northern San Juan and Mesa Verde region, but can differ from these sites and surface characteristics. Paste color is usually dark to gray. Surfaces are slightly polished and usually covered with a white to a slip, very often very streaky wash. This slip is uneven and unslipped patches may be visible. Because Arborist Black and White may encompass both a wide temporal and stylistic range, it may be possible to divide examples of this type into different varieties. Examples including Red Mesa styles or Cortez Black and White may be assumed to represent the early variety of this type. Those displaying Hatcher or later solids all over styles characteristic of Mencos Black and White seem to reflect the later variety. Okay. In Arbolists as well as Piedra Black and White, we see the use of this very distinct mineral paint and crushed igneous rock that includes a combination of dark and light fragments. And except for the streak on the streak in the paste, clay paste, this type seems to be pretty much very similar to that described for Mencos Black and White. Now, as is the case for pottery produced in the late P1 and the Pueblo II area across adjacent areas in the Southwest, including the Mesa Verde and the Cibolan, and even the northern Rio Grande region, the pottery is decorated with the iron paint, and this is used in XRF analysis. This is reflected by a higher frequency of iron in the painted areas as compared to the unpainted areas. So again, we have a distinct tradition, but it's very closely aligned to what's happening in areas to the west in the northern San Juan, as well as to the southwest in the Chaco area. While most of the Pueblo II period or Arborist phase sites in the upper San Juan are very distinct and limited to a small area and often represented by simple rounded small surface structures. A notable exception is is Chimney Rock, um, along situated in the mountains above the Piedra River. I had an opportunity just over 10 years ago to examine pottery from Chimney Rock, and the idea that many people have said that this is a Chaco colony or created by Chaco people who wanted to put a shrine in this very special location seems to be borne out by the pottery. Almost all the gray wares are corrugated and dented that either have sand or crushed igneous temper, identical to that you see in either the Chaco or Mesa Verde area. Likewise, the whitewares are a mixture of Chaco black and white and Mancos black and white. And so that there seems to be no question that this is a site established by folks associated with the greater Chaco system. In addition, I had the opportunity to examine another site with sort of the simple rounded above circular structures characteristic of the arborist associated with a ravine site, which seems to include occupations a little bit earlier, as well as contemporaneous with Chimney Rock. In contrast to Chimney Rock, this pottery is much more similar to that associated with surrounding arborist period sites. It includes much higher frequencies of plain gray wares, and much of the corrugated pottery is the pie corrugated. So near each other, you see combination. You see Chimney Rock, which is definitely ceramically the Chaco thing, and other sites just very close to it that seem to be contemporaneous and are part of this continuing upper San Juan associated with the arborist period. And so you probably have the joining of relations. A possibility is that the arborist folks invited Chaco folks to build this shrine, and probably if you've ever seen Chimney Rock, you can see how it's an enormously special place. And either the Chacoans came into the upper San Juan arborist world, either invited or uninvited. It probably only lasted a generation or two, but so we have one contingency of mineral painted pottery associated with the northern San Juan Chacoan sphere, that while in some ways distinct, also reflects groups that were somehow tied into the bigger Chacoan sphere, and results in this short-lived but spectacular, very interesting and spectacular Chimney Rock Chacoan outlier. Now I want to shift back to the Rosa pottery with the organic or the glazed paint. One thing I should say about is that the glazed and organic paint are probably a variation of a similar and very distinct technology. And when I say glazed paint, this reflects a distinct experiment of of the use of sort of or decorations in organic and sometimes mixed with glaze that seem to be in no no way related to what happens later in the up up upper Colorado and Rio Grande glaze wares. But instead we have the Rosa practicing these unique styles and organic, sometimes glazed paint, and light colored temper, reflecting the use of alluvial sands along the stream beds, and relatively simple decorations that continue with the production of Banco's black and white, which is also decorated with organic paint, alluvial sand, and usually simple decorations. So and much of the Banco's black and white seems to be in the southern part of the upper San Juan world. Okay, and is and the idea is somehow that that the continuation of these traditions may reflect groups practicing highland agriculture who are moving across high elevation areas, first from an upper San Juan area and then into the Gallina area. And the sites in the Gallina, particularly the Gallina highlands propers, are very distinct from those in the rest of the surrounding public world, that they have no ritual structures. Structures have extremely wide walls and are 4 times as wide. And again, the differences has sometimes contributed to the Anasazi hillbilly myth. One of them was another very interesting thing about the Gallina is that the overwhelming majority of the pottery is plain with very distinct, sometimes pointy bottoms of vessels, and again very distinct from what is being the corrugated pottery being made in the surrounding Mesa Verde and Chaco areas. And when there is decoration toward the rim, it seems to be very simple, very consisting of smeared bands, and so and just the shape, particularly with the pointed bottoms, are very, very different. The decorations of the painted pottery is as reflected by these bowls here, sort of reflects a combination of very simple designs that seem to be directly out of Rosa and changing very little over the centuries, where you have very isolated designs, sometimes embellished by just a little bit of decoration toward the center, but with and occasionally a presence of sort of simple versions of types of Hatcher designs are seen here, reflected in the Mesa Verde or Chaco area, but for the most part, here you kind of see a variation of the circle and then simple lines, and this pottery seems to be dated from about 1050 to 1300, and also in contrast to other pottery made in other regions during this time. It is mostly unpolished, unsloped, with um, um, and bumpy surfaces. And it also includes very distinct shaped jars with a very thin rim, very simple decorations that seem to reflect, again, a combination of Rosa light, are very simple variations of designs you might see during the later period. And occasionally, the continue you get something here with a very pink surface, and this just may reflect that the use of clays that are very absorptive and allow the continuation of this tradition and the use of organic paint. Now this is very interesting too, that here we have a Rosa black and white vessel. It's probably from a site dating to like 1200. But it has very much characteristics of the Rosa styles, with a little bit of line work on the side. And you have organic paint, and also like the Gallina, but in distinct of the stuff being made in the northern San Juan, you have a very light color igneous rock reflecting weathered, the use of weathered alluvial deposits. So in many ways, what we really seem to see is a continuation of the Rosa tradition. Here's a really good example of where you have, for sites, you have 12 to 1300 AD made from the Mesa Verde in Upper San Juan. By this time, they're also using organic paint that is similar to that used in, but although it's a darker color. And then you have the Rosa, and look, even though there's a 400-year plus separation, how similar the Rosa black and white is to the Gallina, and how distinct it is to the Mesa Verde black and white that is being made at the same time. So again, this has led to a lot of speculation of why the Gallina pottery is both so isolated, distinct, and conservative. And again, and back to the idea that you seem to have a system that is adapted to mountain farming, moving from the Upper San Juan to Gallina, and along with maintaining sort of the similar strategies, seem to be more isolated from the rest of the Pueblo world. And also, and both the distinct ceramics and the distinct architectures seem to represent more conservative strategies associated with a very different adaptive system. Another way of thinking about the differences that we see in between the Colorado, the Gallina, the Upper San Juan, and Gallina, as compared, is that the different regional systems that we see are a result of an adaptation to broad geographic and geological zones. So the group that we sometimes call the Anasazi or the Northern Ancestral Pueblo is adapted to both agricultural strategies and the use of pottery resources associated with the many marine or geological clays. The group that we call sometimes the Magion are use of strategies within these sort of volcanic fields in the southwest part of the state. Um, um, the Rio Grande area reflects strategies associated with the floodplains created by the Rio Grande Rift. And so again, the history of these folks, that sometimes based on pottery and other attributes that archaeologists have struggled to define, may simply be due to folks dealing with highland areas along the southern Rocky Mountains that straddle the continental divide. And it is possible that this represents a long strategy of folks starting in the upper San Juan and then moving into the Gallina. And then so the upper San Juan is reflected best by the Gallina from 700 to 850. Then you have this sort of gap, but we assume there's continual occupations. But part of the problem is, especially on the shared basis, it can be pretty hard to distinguish components dating from the Rosa, Bancos, and Gallina periods, especially if it's just assembly just with sherds. And then finally, something that I haven't really mentioned much yet is that the system may even move south into another mountain range, the Jemez, and it's reflected by the Jemez Pueblo, who were occupying the Jemez Mountains during the protohistoric and very historic periods until they moved out of that into lower areas after the Pueblo revolt. And so now I want to move into a little bit more speculation. And we have to, every time you do a ceramic talk and you make the next step of who were these people, the first thing you have to say is pottery is not people. Given that, it's sometimes fun to speculate on what we are seeing. The whole Southwest is divided into Pueblo region. You have distinct linguistic groups, the Uto-Aztectum and the Hopi area that may be connected with the Tusayan, Sunni, the Keres area, and then as part of that, and then you oops. And then across much of the Rio Grande drainage, we have Tanoan languages that include the Towa groups spread across the northern Rio Grande. And they seem, and so you seem to have the Tiwa Pueblos and the Tewa Pueblos and Taos, and they're all connected they share similar languages, but they're separated. And the most interesting language is the Toa, which becomes separated from the rest of the Tanoan languages that include the Tewa Pueblos and the Tiwa Pueblos. Just before the event or introduction of agriculture in the Pueblo area. And so I know this is a lot of speculation just based on pottery and other things. But finally, do we have this does the pottery and the connections reveal this very long history of connection of groups associated with high elevation farming along the slopes, ridges, and upper drainages of the Pueblo world. So if you look at the upper San Juan, the Gallina, and the Jemez region, what you see are areas sort of straddling the continental divide. Some areas like the upper San Juan in the uppermost regions of the western slopes of the divide, and others like the Gallina among the slopes. And so the upper San Juan sometimes gets put in to the same groups as the Mesa Verde and all these folks who are also on the drainages that go into the Colorado River. And where the Gallina sometimes, because they're on the upper slopes of the Chama River that flows into the Rio Grande, get put in the Rio Grande region. But we may have a long history of people moving along the continental divide, practicing highland agriculture, ultimately, historically, settling in another mountainous area, the Jemez Mountains. And so finally, you have the pottery during the late prehistoric that dates just after the Gallina and into the proto-historic. Again, these very distinct mountain farmers. And so the question finally is are these groups connected? And again, we should emphasize that there's a lot of speculation, mostly because this is still a pretty poorly understood area, especially between the gaps between the upper San Juan, the Gallina, and the Jemez. Okay. And I guess that concludes the talk.
Thank you very much. It was very interesting.
Thank you. So are there some questions?
We have a question from Eve right up there. Concern about lead and leaching out into people's water and food.
That often is a question, not only for the upper San Juan, but even more so for the later occupations in the Rio Grande, which is unrelated but similar innovation. And I've heard the argument for both cases. But personally, I don't know of any real evidence of harm. It may have not just been enough, but but it would be something some similarities on population stresses between the areas of the Upper San Juan where there was glaze and things that were happening in the northern Rio Grande with the introduction of glaze may be very interesting, but I don't know enough about studies that have been done with the human remains. I don't know of any specific ones that have been.
There's another question from Eve. Are the Jemez people the only ones left who speak Toa?
That's another good and complicated question. There's some speculation that Pecos may have spoke it prior to them moving into Jemez Pueblo after the Pueblo revolt, but that's a very interesting. Others say that in fact they didn't speak Toa, that they may have spoken a variation of Tanoan language that was more closely related to what may have been spoken by Tanoan groups in the Galisteo Basin. So my guess would be that during the prehistoric and protohistoric, that Toa language was probably limited to Jemez Pueblo. But I'm not a linguist.
There was one on pigment. There was one on pigment, but it was like earlier.
Does anybody here have a question?
In the function of the vessels with rounded bottoms.
We did have a question earlier about the sort of paint and pigments that were used, as well as the significance and symbolism of designs. Is it a connection to culture and ritual? And a question that perhaps the pointy bottoms means that these were hanging or nestled in a cooking fire.
Yes, and there's also there's also been some studies and speculations about that and the reflection of vessels as reflecting mobility. An interesting fact is that the other group that made similar pointy bottomed vessels were early Navajos who re-entered the Upper San Juan region several centuries after the abandonment of this region by ancestral Pueblos. And while it would be tempting to say, well, the Navajo may have been related to the Gallina, I think a more likely explanation may reflect the, like you said hanging, or that such pointy bottoms may be functionally similar, and thus adopted by two distinct groups who occupy highland environments, that even if they weren't related. Oh, goodbye. Thank you very much for everybody for listening.